Well, greetings. My name is Rappold. I'm a shareholder specializing in environmental law in Greenberg, Traurig's Washington, D.C. office. I'm, like many of you, working from home these days. And I'm here with a few quick tips for maintaining environmental compliance or dealing with environmental compliance issues during the pandemic. So the first tip I have is it's important to review your existing emergency plans for your facility or your site. That might seem pretty obvious. Maybe less obvious is making sure that people other than those who would typically have it have access to it. Because with the ever-changing dynamics and people unfortunately getting sick or having to quarantine, it may be that you need other folks to have access that might not normally have access. Number two, take out your calendar, whether it's electronic or paper, and calendar the next 6 months of your environmental obligations. It's just really helpful to have that list in front of you, to know what's coming up, to know what you need to do, so that you can anticipate and plan for various contingencies. Number three, take a moment to review relief provisions that exist in federal environmental and state environmental statutes and regulations and various legal instruments that might be governing your compliance obligations or cleanup obligations. Those documents and laws have, in many instances, relief provisions for certain kinds of emergencies. Take a look at those in conjunction with your 6-month calendar and see whether any of those apply to you. And also be mindful that several states, in addition to the federal government, have issued enforcement discretion policies. What that means is, while the pandemic is on, obviously, the primary expectation, the baseline expectation is compliance, but there's an understanding that there may be instances where you can't meet all of your obligations. It's important to make sure you're fully acquainted with what the parameters are in those policies. We have a few blog posts up about them. It's important to document exactly why the pandemic led to your inability to comply. So we commend you to take a look at those policies. Number four, this is key. Develop and implement an effective communication strategy. Obviously, there's a lot of different stakeholders who are interested right now. Your shareholders, your employees, your vendors, your purchasers, the community. And it's important to have a plan and an important message and stick with those messages. I think we've all seen a lot of the "we're all in this together" messaging, and while that's helpful and nice to hear, I think the community and employees may be looking for some more specifics about what your business is doing specifically to deal with various issues during the pandemic. I've touched on this a little bit before, but it's really important. Make sure that you document all of the efforts you take to comply despite the emergency circumstances. This might mean that you have to do more documentation than perhaps you're used to. It's important to talk about that with your team and your legal counsel, because certainly there may be privileges, attorney-client privilege, for example, that might apply in certain circumstances. So you want to make sure that you're doing that in a way that maintains that privilege. Obviously, number 6, this is a biggie. Pay close attention to your local, state, and federal declarations ordinances and requirements. Obviously, this is a very dynamic situation. The recommendations are changing seemingly on a daily basis, if not sometimes hourly. We're still learning a lot about this virus and how it spreads and whom it affects and what's the most important thing that we need to do to keep us safe. So make sure you're paying attention to those. Number 7, if when you go back to your calendaring effort, you can look ahead and say, oh my goodness, 4 months from now, I am sure I'm not going to be able to meet a particular compliance obligation, a certain reporting obligation, or some other cleanup obligation. Start to prepare your relief documentation early. It's helpful to have that in hand, ready to go if it's necessary, and hopefully it won't be. But it's better than trying to scramble in a rush when everyone is facing the same deadline at the same time. And finally, remember that compliance is the baseline obligation. So if you can comply, you have the means to comply, by all means do. It'll assuage your worries, because that'll be one other worry that you don't have to be preoccupied with, and you can feel secure that if you're complying, you're not going to face some follow-on consequences that you don't want. Anyway, those are my quick tips for environmental compliance during the pandemic. I hope all of you and your families are well and staying safe. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to give us a shout. We're also closely monitoring all the developments, and there's a lot of information on the Greenberg Traurig website, so please take a chance to look at it, and be well.